one Northwest District Attorney, among a number of others who are doing somewhat similar things. This guy is a self-declared social justice warrior. He has decided not to prosecute some people for actual crimes because he agrees with their politics. But if you're conservative, watch out, because you could end up prosecuted, convicted, and spending time in jail or spending the rest of your life with a criminal record if you run afoul of the Mike Schmidt show. And it is a real Schmidt show as far as I'm concerned. I thought we'd talk about that with Angus Lee, who's an attorney who's involved in this case. Mr. Lee, it's a pleasure. Welcome to the program.
Always a pleasure, Lars. Thanks for having me.
Tell me about the cases involving Joey Gibson, who's been on this show before, and Russell Schultz for violating Oregon's anti-riot statute, and why you see a political bias and perhaps even a religious bias in the prosecution of these men.
All right. So if you go back to May 1st of 2019, there was a political protest outside of an Antifa hangout known as Cider Riot. Mr. Gibson and Mr. Schultz exercised their right to protest Antifa activity. And on the patio of that bar, the Cider Riot bar, were dozens of masked Antifa members. And Mr. Gibson in 2019 was calling a warning to the city of Portland saying, this is where Antifa hangs out. They're bad for the community. You shouldn't be promoting Antifa. And of course, as everyone knows now, Mr. Gibson was right. He was 100% right. When he approached the bar, stood on a public sidewalk, and simply expressed his opinion, he was immediately pepper sprayed. Things were thrown at him. He was spit upon. At no point did he engage in any violent or tumultuous conduct. In fact, every moment of Mr. Gibson's activity was videoed because he live streamed the entire event. Mr. Gibson always videos at these protests, and he's always nonviolent personally. Mr. Schultz, very much the same, was with Mr. Gibson. All they did was express their opinion from a public street and a public sidewalk. Now, the Antifa members attacked them, and violence did occur by Antifa and others involved, but not Mr. Gibson or Mr. Schultz. And in fact, a doorman for the Antifa bar, Cider Riot, actually came out and physically engaged in a fight with one other person and punched him in the face, kicked him, knocked him to the ground. One person who was there on the Antifa side was videoed and identified, spitting right in Mr. Gibson's face. And after that event, the police investigated Mr. Gibson, Mr. Schultz, the conservatives involved in the protest, and took no action against the Antifa members who engaged in clear criminal activity. The same is true for the prosecutor's office in Multnomah County. They only prosecuted the conservative people, and they prosecuted Mr. Schultz and Mr. Gibson with what I believe is no evidence. In a recent federal ruling, the judge wrote in the ruling that Mr. Gibson and Mr. Schultz make a compelling case that they never engaged in any violent or tumultuous conduct. Yet, the Multnomah County Prosecutor's Office, while allowing Antifa members to riot and burn throughout months and months of 2020 and dismissing those riot cases, has continued to prosecute only two people for a standalone riot charge, and that would be Mr. Gibson and Schultz. The only people they are prosecuting for simply the charge of riot are these two people who the evidence shows did nothing at all.
That cannot be legal, can it, Mr. Lee?
No, it's selective prosecution, and it's a violation of our First Amendment right to be able to say what we want in a protest. It's a violation of our 14th Amendment rights to not be selectively prosecuted for simply expressing our viewpoint.
I point out to my audience all the time that famous John Adams quote about him, a nation of men, or a nation of laws, not a nation of men. Because in a nation of laws, we all get treated equally under the law. In a nation of men, somebody like Mike Schmidt, the elected DA, can say, I agree with Antifa, and he has said that, and then dismiss almost 1,000 criminal charges against Antifa members, and then take up a selective not litigation, but prosecution of somebody like Mr. Schultz or Mr. Gibson. So what's it going to take to get justice for these two?
So there's a couple of avenues we're pursuing. The federal judge in the case we had against Mike Schmidt did say that we'd made a strong case that Mr. Gibson and Schultz did not engage in riot, but said that this matter should be brought to the state court as a selective prosecution motion. And so we're pursuing that. The other thing that we've done is we have filed a complaint with the prosecutor's office of Multnomah County for selective prosecution in violation of their own written policy that is mandated by state law and requires that they not engage in prosecution that is biased in relation to political viewpoint, which is clearly happening here, or religious affiliation, which the evidence suggests is happening here. One of the things that we recently discovered in the federal case was files with photographs, 2 files with photographs of essentially face shots of Mr. Gibson and Mr. Schultz. And the prosecutors had internally labeled the photograph of Mr. Gibson as Gibson rooted in Christ. They did the same thing for Russell Schultz. Russell Schultz rooted in Christ. And I can tell you as a former elected prosecutor and as a current defense attorney, there's absolutely no reason for a prosecutor to be labeling exhibits internally as rooted in Christ unless it's religious bias against Christians.
Well, I mean, for instance, if they had said this person is rooted in Islam or rooted in Judaism, I would imagine there'd be a firestorm in the woke Pacific Northwest. But if you go after Christian conservatives, then that's, I guess, they want to treat that differently. How soon might you see some positive results for these two?
Well, the good news is when we filed our complaint under Multnomah County's policy, we also pointed out to them that their policy requires the first assistant district attorney to investigate the case. And since he would be investigating his boss, he would have a conflict of interest. And so we called on them to appoint a special prosecutor. And so now Brad Berry of Yamhill County has been appointed as special prosecutor to review this complaint.
Mr. Lee, hold that thought for just a moment. I'm going to hold Mr. Lee over if he's got the time to do it and ask about whether this solves the problem long-term or only in this one case. We'll get .com. Now, I've been talking to Angus Lee, who's an attorney in Washington State, but this is an Oregon case. It involves a local district attorney I've been plenty critical of, and that's Mike Schmidt, recently just elected last year. And he's the one who's decided to decline to prosecute. I might have said he dismissed them earlier. It's not the right legal term. He's declined to prosecute almost 1,000 cases involving Antifa terrorists and members of the violent Black Lives Matter group. But on the other hand, he has brought charges against 2 gentlemen, Joey Gibson, who you've heard on this program from Patriot Prayer, and Russell Schultz for a violation of the state's anti-riot statute, even though, as Mr. Lee points out, there's no evidence whatsoever they engaged in riot. At the same time, the people who physically attacked them, and they did physically attack them, this is all caught on video at a place called Cider Riot back in 2019, that they were not prosecuted. The attackers were not, but Joey Gibson and Russell Schultz were. Let me get to this issue. I hope you win this case on behalf of Schultz and Gibson. Okay, because I think it's the right result. I don't just say that because I consider Joey Gibson a good guy. He's been on the program before, and as I said, he's taken all the questions, and I think he represents a good, solid group, Patriot Prayer. But does this have the potential to actually sanction in any way whatsoever Mike Schmidt so that he stops behaving this way as a district attorney? Or do the voters just have to wait for the next election to vote him out?
Well, when the investigation of Schmidt comes out, if it's a fair investigation, it will conclude that his office has engaged in selective prosecution. And then we can bring a motion before the court on that issue. And of course, selective prosecution is a violation of constitutional rights. And so that may also result in some sanctioning from the State Bar Association. But Lars, I did want to go back. You mentioned that you corrected yourself and said that he did not charge these cases. The reality is he did not charge many cases, but he did in fact dismiss cases that had already been charged, and I think that's been lost in the news. There were several cases that had been charged and were undergoing formal prosecution for riot and the like under the prior administration when the riots started in June and July. And when Schmidt came out with his policy, which, by the way, was written by a group in Texas, okay?
So in other words, this didn't originate from the man who was at least ostensibly chosen by the voters. He was simply mimicking a policy written by another group way outside the region. So if people have elections for district attorney, I think it's worth mentioning one of the reasons we elect district attorneys, prosecutors, is because we want the public to sense we have some control over how a prosecutor acts. There have been bad prosecutors in America, and there are good prosecutors in America, but if they don't act right, the public has the ability to sanction them the ultimate way, which is, well, not the ultimate way, but they can remove them from office in any case. But if this guy is just mimicking a policy that comes from some other group in a state 2,000 miles away, they're not exactly getting the local representation you'd hope by having elected district attorneys.
That's right. And the policy that was created by this very small, select, discrete group out in Texas is a policy that the policy writers don't have to live with. So nobody in Portland actually dreamed up this insane policy that has resulted in so much destruction and really just the devastation of the downtown Portland area. The people who wrote this policy get to sit back and, frankly, probably laugh at what they've done because they don't have to live with it. But when that policy went into effect, they didn't just stop prosecuting cases going forward. They went back and they dismissed cases from the prior administration.
The only reason I corrected myself was because for the cases that were brought to him as DA, he declined to prosecute. And I know other people have called that dismissing. It's not and I just want to make sure that I don't get tied up with somebody who says Lars is using the wrong language to describe what happened. But you're right. To take cases that were already in the process of being prosecuted and then simply have the district attorney say, I'm going to dismiss them. And it's not hard to see the pattern here. If social justice warrior Mike Schmidt sees these folks as his political allies, and he's talked a lot about his, I guess his adherence to or belief in the Antifa philosophy. If he says, I'm not going to prosecute my political friends, but I'm going to use hammer and tong to go after people who are my political opponents, then he's behaving in exactly the way the American criminal justice system is not supposed to behave.
That's right. And when you look at what the attorney for Mike Schmidt said at the last federal hearing when asked, what exactly is it that Russell Schultz did that amounts to riot, that you've got to be prosecuting him? They said he stood there, yelled, and shook his finger.
Well, that's classic First Amendment, right?
Exactly. And when we have a prosecutor who is prosecuting people for political activity he disagrees with, but allowing criminal activity for those whose political position he does agree with, we don't have a free society. We don't have a democracy. We don't have a First Amendment. And you really have to resist that because that is tyranny.
What's the worst a judge could order if he finds that Schmidt has knowingly and deliberately violated the constitutional rights of people? What's the worst sanction a judge could bring on him?
The worst sanction that a trial judge could bring on him is to dismiss the cases, and that would, of course, be embarrassing, and it would be an indictment, and it would show that he was, in fact, engaging in this selective prosecution. Unfortunately, I think that if Mr. Schultz was found to be engaged in selective prosecution, he would probably feel proud about it. He would probably brag about it because he believes that people like Mr. Gibson, who express a conservative viewpoint, should be prosecuted just for that.
This is it's just wrong. But is there any situation under which a trial judge could issue, say, you can tell I'm not an attorney, but could issue a temporary restraining order restraining Mike Schmidt from using a political basis to decide prosecutions? Well,
only the federal court could do that, and that's what we went to federal court for. But as you've seen in the last several months with our federal courts, they They are becoming very, very resistant to involving themselves in matters that have a political tinge to them, and they refuse to hear the case on standing grounds. And that's exactly what happened in the federal case we just had, where even though the judge said that we had made a strong showing that there was no riot by Gibson and Schultz, and even though the prosecutor's office had failed completely to explain why the non-prosecution policy wasn't applied to them, the federal judge said, yeah, but the federal courts just have to stay out of it, so we're not going to rule on the merits.
I think that's
and
political
you need to go to
cowardice.
the state court.
Mr. Lee, I appreciate that. It's Angus Lee, who's an attorney from Washington State, representing this Oregon case that goes right to the heart of whether we're a nation of laws or a nation of men, men like Mike Schmidt, the social justice warrior. Coming up, the young lady who'd like to replace failed Republican